Okay, my name is Alan Journay. I am one of the co-facilitators of Southern Oregon Climate Action Now. The other one is sitting right here, and you will see more of Kathy a bit later on. I'd like to welcome you to our monthly program. As you probably know, these happen every month, the last Tuesday of the month for an hour. We have a program on something that relates to climate change. Excuse me. A few Zoom tips for those who haven't been using Zoom quite as often as those of us who seem to be on Zoom meetings every hour of the day. Whilst we're running through the program, please mute yourself, which you can do at the bottom left of your screen with the microphone item. Icon, just click on that and it'll mute you. Stay muted, please, throughout the program. Questions we are going to invite to be submitted through the chat, which is click on the icon, which is right in the middle of the series of icons on the bottom of your screen. And please write your questions into chat and then hit submit, and they'll come to us. And what we're going to be doing is having Ellie Cosgrove at the appropriate time taking questions out of the chat and asking those to our speakers. You have you have visual options. If you go to the top right hand of your screen, you'll see a choice, a view icon, and you can select either side-by-side speaker or side-by-side gallery, depending on whether you want to see the speakers or the Hollywood Squares kind of image. The presentation, as you probably know, as you joined, is being recorded, and it will be available in the SOCAN YouTube channel on the SOCAN website at a later time, as soon as Kathy has it edited. Next. The format for this evening, we have an hour-long program. The focus will be on the presentations from our two speakers, who will be introduced in just a moment. As I said, responses to questions will be elicited from our speakers, questions that have been posted in the chat. And the last 5 to 10 minutes of the program, Kathy will be back to give you an update on SOCAN climate actions and other group climate actions. We also will be posting on our website at the page, which is socan.eco/action, links that the speakers mentioned during the course of their presentations and actions that you might be able to take in relation to the presentations that you're going to hear tonight. Now I'd like to hand the baton over to Hogan Shiro, who's going to do a stalwart job of introducing our two speakers. Over to you, Hogan.
Thanks, Alan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I have the honor of introducing our two speakers tonight. First, we have John Villella, who's a senior botanist with Siskiyou BioSurvey and has spent the last 2 decades working with rare species of terrestrial vegetation, including plants, bryophytes, lichens, and fungi. This work has taken him from Northern California to Northern Alaska, where he has seen the effects of climate change firsthand. Then we also have with us Michael Parker, who's an aquatic ecologist, professor, and former chair of the biology program at SOU, where he teaches a diversity of courses, including aquatic ecology, fish and fisheries, vertebrate natural history, and herpetology. His research focuses on the conservation of aquatic organisms and the environments that sustain them. He has been actively involved in research within the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, including a long-term population study of the rare and federally listed Oregon-spotted frog. Michael has been here a while. For 28 years, he's been at SOU, and he was a student there in the late 70s, early 80s. Man, I'm not even going to think how old that makes you, Michael. Where he developed his passion for natural history. I want to say quickly that I know John by reputation only, and I was thrilled when I heard that we landed him for taking part of the plant section of this presentation. I have had the honor of working alongside Michael as a colleague at SOU and seeing him work firsthand in the field. And when we wanted someone to talk about the impacts of climate change on animals from our area, there was only one name that came to mind for me. So I'm really thrilled with both of our speakers tonight, and I hope you guys enjoy this presentation.
So John, we'll let you share your screen and unmute and go ahead and take it over. John, you're muted still.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Just getting the technology going here. Okay, how does that look? Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really honored to be here tonight to present some information to you about climate change and everything that doesn't walk around. So basically, I'm gonna talk a little bit about plants and the factors that influence their distribution and that sort of a thing in relation to climate change. And then I'm going to give a couple of case studies of some research that I've done over the past few years related to climate change. And those case studies will be looking at lichens, which is one of the things that I'm most interested in. So yeah, as you heard, I've been a botanist for about 20 years or so, and I've had a chance to visit a lot of the rare plants in our region. And yeah, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about them here. Yeah, okay, so the first concept I want to talk about is what are the factors that are affecting terrestrial vegetation that are being exacerbated by climate change. And this image here is just kind of a visual image to demonstrate three of the main factors. We have temperature, moisture, and fire. And all of our species of plants and other vegetation basically exist within a climate envelope that is affected by these various factors. So if you think about along this triangle, where let's say closer to the each of these various points would be a higher temperature. So let's, as you move closer to this, the temperatures increase. Same thing with moisture, that you can imagine this as a gradient. And then also fire, the effects of fire, both in fire return interval and fire intensity. Those are both major factors for what will allow a species to persist on the landscape. So each of these factors comes into play, and within this context, species are able to survive or not survive on the landscape based on what the climate envelope is on the site at which they're occurring. And unlike the critters that Michael will talk about later, plants mostly don't have the ability to get up and walk away, and so they will live or die based on the conditions that are occurring at the site where they're existing. So there's also some human factors besides climate change, which also contribute to vegetation and what is allowing species to occur on the landscape. Some of these things are logging practices, and particularly the salvage logging that happens after you get a major climate affected fire. Also invasive species, which have the ability to take over a landscape after a major climate event such as fire, that sort of a thing. And they are also existing within these climate envelopes, but depending on what species are occurring in a given landscape, invasive species can have a major effect on what's surviving in that area. And then also another major contributing factor that affects vegetation is habitat fragmentation. And this is based on the management practices in terms of logging and development, road building, any kind of infrastructure, that sort of a thing. So all of these are kind of an outline sketch of the factors that are at play when it comes to terrestrial vegetation. Now the specific plant communities in our region that are most at risk, and I've got some examples here showing some of the different species that occur within these communities. One of the major plant communities that will feel the effects of climate change the quickest is the high alpine communities. Many of these species are existing only, on the northern slope of a high alpine peak in the Siskiyou Mountains. And as the climate warms up and as as we move closer to the point on that triangle, as the temperatures increase, well, then that's going to eliminate species, and they're not going to be able to move any higher up because they're already at the highest peaks. Many of our peaks in our region have endemic species and rare species. An example of that would be something like the showy raylardella, which is only found in the high alpine areas in the Trinity Alps. Also, species that are at the southern end of their range are going to be more adversely affected because they're already existing in a marginal habitat for their climate window. And many of those species which are rare in our region are species which are relics of a time when the climate was cooler and wetter. Some of those species would be things like the Alaska yellow cedar, which occurs in a few sporadic locations in the Siskiyou Mountains and the Klamath Mountains. But another one of these species that as the climate warms, we may see that species not be able to survive. An example of a lichen, the Oregon lungwort, is another example of a species which is really enigmatic of the coastal rainforest, and it's existing at the southern end of its range here, and I'll speak more about that later. Also, species which take a long time to establish after fire, as the fire return intervals shorten, then these types of species, which may take 5 or 10 years or 20 years before they flower from the time they're established, those species are also highly at risk because as the fire becomes more frequent on the landscape, they may not be able to survive under those conditions. And then hydrologically sensitive species, and these are species which occur on the edges of lakes, on the edges of streams, in areas where a change in the hydrology caused by climate change could change the water availability for them, and they will also be eliminated from the landscape. And some examples of that are both this showy raylardella and the clustered lady slipper, which are both rare plants in our region. So basically what we're having happen is over time, we're getting a conversion of the landscape where it's going from really, large trees, lots of carbon storage, thick duff layers, lots of shade. This is being provided by these old growth forests, but then due to climate change and due to what I would consider to be mismanagement of our forests, what we end up with is a picture like you see on the right-hand side of this slide, which is where most of the carbon is not on the landscape anymore. You have very little duff, very little hardwood. You have some standing snags that are from the forest that was once there, but also the forest is not reproducing the conifer trees and such. Checking my time here, I'm getting pretty close here, so I'm going to move on. Also, the invasive species. So another thing I wanted to chat about, that something I observed just out in the forest lately, is the effects of this heat dome. And this is an example of the stochastic event that happens, that is basically when the climate envelope for a given species is exceeded on the temperature gradient. And in that case, what we've seen, and this is something this is the only time I've seen this in my 20 years of working out in the forest around here, the leaves of these trees are being scorched and being killed. Some of these things are perennial plants like salal and sword fern. And my sense is that if we had a heat dome event that happened for a week or two, we would see some major changes in the environment based on that, because of this scorch that's happening. Okay, I'm going to talk about my case studies here real quick, and I'm hoping I will be able to get this all in the next couple of minutes. The first study that I was involved in that's related to this is the looking at the effects of wildfire on lichen communities in chaparral ecosystems in California. And lichens are important in these ecosystems because they're a major component of the biodiversity. More lichen species than plant species in a given area. Also, they play key roles in nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and then also absorbing water from the atmosphere. And also they support wildlife through nesting and foraging. So here's the study site that we did our study in, looking at the changes in the communities of lichens over a fire gradient. This is an example of the when we started our study, and this is a 65-year-old shrub stand. This is down around Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Here it is, the same site a year after. This was taken earlier this year when there was a fire that came through there and basically charred the whole entire landscape. Our whole entire study site was burned after we had conducted this study. What we found in this study is that as the shrubs grow in, it takes about 30 years for you to get the most of the species back onto the landscape. And also some species may not return for up to 100 years after fire as the conditions continue to become better for them on the landscape. Some of the more rare and species, the cyanolichens, the ones with bacteria in them, were only found in the oldest plots. And also during the study, we discovered a new to science lichen, which just goes to point out how in some of these ecosystems, there's still new species to be discovered. If you look at this graph, you can see that on the x-axis you have the time since fire, on the y-axis you have the average richness. As you can see, as you move along and have a longer time since fire, all of the major groups of lichens will increase over time. And in this slide, you can see the also as over time, as you go, the shrub cover increases, and then at a certain point, once the shrubs have all filled in, the lichen diversity kind of, or the shrub cover becomes constant. But then also, as you look at the time since fire, the richness of lichen species increases. Once the canopy closes, it's still increasing, and there's more species which are being accumulated over time, although at a slower rate. Here's just a picture of that new to science species which we discovered while doing this plot. Okay, so I'm trying to go a little bit fast because I want to make sure I get everything in here. Now I'm gonna talk about a second study, which is looking at a lichen which is found at the southern edge of its range here in our region. This lichen was, the study we did here was conducted in Six Rivers National Forest, looking at the Oregon lungwort. This is a Northwest endemic, a rare species in California, and again, a nitrogen fixer and a very charismatic species. So let's see, this is a little out of order here. First, the methods, we climbed quite a few trees and we mapped the distribution of the lichen within the canopy, looking at where it was occurring. And again, this is at the southern end of its range. And what we found is that there is a distinct distributional pattern here. The grayer, the darker, blacker color means that there isn't an occurrence, and the whiter color here shows where it does occur. So if you look at this graph, you can see that there's a major blob in the mid canopy area at the upper, at the middle canopy area, far out on the branch tips. But then there's also another major area which this lichen occurs, which is unique to the southern edge of its range, which is on the small diameter trees lower down in the canopy. This is a position within the canopy where the lichen is finding the right habitat characteristics, but only at the southern edge of its range. The point of this is that species will act differently depending on where they are. As those climate envelopes change, you may end up getting some of these species which are only occurring on these range edges being eliminated by the climate change. So the conclusions are what I just explained, that the lichen can be occurring in the upper canopy, but then also in this area, it can occur on small diameter trees in the lower canopy. Okay. Yeah, so then as part of this study, we provided some recommendations on what things can be done in order to help maintain this species. And really what it boils down to is maintaining the canopy as much as possible, those large trees. And also I want to point out, that's one of my main points that I've noticed is we really need to maintain those older forests, because they're standing now, they're resilient, they're capturing carbon, but once they're cut down, we really don't have we don't really know if they're going to grow back in the same way, because the ecosystem is changing. So yeah, that's my presentation, and I will be happy to take questions at the end. And yeah, I'll pass it on to Michael.
Yeah, all right. Well, we have time. We'll do one question here real quick, and then I'll pass things off, if that's all okay. Just a quick question from Camille. In tonight's news reports about the Condor fire near Lake Tahoe, the comment was made that fire suppression during recent years has contributed to the ferocity of the current fire. How does this work?
So the basic concept with this is that when you have a low intensity fire that comes through, it can basically burn in the understory, and we consider that to be a healthy fire. And in those cases, the older, bigger trees are able to survive, and the younger fuels are eliminated through a low intensity burn. But what has happened over time is we've gone in over the last 100 years and put out all of these fires, and then you get regrowth coming in that is not being trimmed off as quickly as it would be, and these grow up, and that becomes what we call ladder fuels, and that is what carries the fire from the ground level, where it's not very where we want it to be, where that's what we consider a good fire. But with these ladder fuels, it's carried into the upper canopy, And then that's when you get the high intensity burns and these burns that are eliminating these large old trees.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll go ahead and turn things over to Michael.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, John. That was awesome. That's
Great.
a very cool lichen. So I'm going to take a bit of a turn and look at some animal examples. And my examples are going to be focused primarily on amphibians. In a short amount of time, you have to sort of decide what you're going to work on. And these are the things I've been working on the most recently. And I'm an aquatic ecologist, so I'm going to focus on aquatic systems primarily. But hopefully what you'll see at the end is that amphibians really are good indicators. And we can use them as sort of canaries in the coal mine to ask questions about how climate disruption is likely to affect other animal populations as well. And I included this slide on the cover because this is a bucket of Oregon spotted frogs from a study that I'm doing from last summer. And it just reminds me of that metaphor of the frog soup, or the frog soup story, where as you slowly increase the temperature on your bucket of frogs, they don't notice it, and so they don't jump out. And over time, you end up with, well, frog soup. And I think that's sort of what's happening to many of our amphibians and other animals as we experience what's turning out to be a much more rapid climate change than we would have initially anticipated. So I could pick a lot of different animals, and I focused on amphibians. I threw this collage together just to say some of the things that I'm going to be talking about could be applied to any group of animals, including those that are represented here. Most of these are organisms that are being studied. I know John Alexander talked to you a couple of years ago about the effects of climate change on birds, and he probably focused on sort of seasonal mismatch between food availability and migrating birds. And everybody knows the pika up there on the upper left. This is an animal that actually was recently discovered here in the northern parts of the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument. And I'm a little worried that after that heat dome event that we had that John just talked about, that population may have winked out just in the last year. So anyway, we could talk about just about any of these different groups. And we could talk about what are the direct effects of an increase in temperature. And the direct effects usually have to do with the physiology of these organisms, whether they be endothermic organisms like the mammals and the birds, or ectotherms like the insects, the fish, the amphibians, and the reptiles. Because temperature directly affects the physiological rates and thereby their ability to maintain homeostasis, that is, maintain internal body conditions that allow them to survive. And it's these physiological rates and metabolic efficiencies and thermal tolerances and the ability to maintain water balance that are adaptations to specific environmental conditions. And when you change those, and when you change them rapidly, organisms have very little ability then to adapt to those kinds of changes. So those are some of the direct effects. What are more complicated and harder to parse out are some of the indirect effects. And these are the kinds of things that we talk about a lot these days, which is changes in resource availability. Those can be water, they can be food, they can be nesting sites, they can be areas to get away during the winter. Interspecific interactions, whether it be competition for those resources. The competitive outcomes can change depending on the availability and quality of resources. And we're hearing a lot about the redistribution of things like parasites and pathogens as the climate changes that are putting species at risk, including human species, our species. And then some of the things like John just talked about in terms of ecosystem processes like nutrient cycles. And I work on rivers and river systems, and so flow regimes in response to changes in precipitation patterns are really important to the organisms that I study, including many of the amphibians that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, or things like that juvenile coho salmon on the bottom there that have evolved to outmigrate during the spring on the flood that comes with a winter snow melt. And when we lose our winter snow melt and we have more of our precipitation happening as rainfall during the winter, the predictability of that spring flood to carry these juvenile fish out to sea where they'll grow and come back to spawn is no longer available to them, and they're often stranded. And things like that winter stonefly on the bottom there, really interesting group of insects that come out and reproduce on the snow in the winter. We see them a lot in the Cascade Mountains around here. And what happens when they lose their snowpack that's responsible for their breeding success? So again, we could talk about any one of these. We could talk about the direct effects of temperature increase, and we could talk about those indirect effects. And it's a very complicated picture. What I want to do is hopefully convince you that amphibians are pretty good indicators of how animal populations in general are likely to respond or be affected by, and mostly in a negative way, by changes in our climate. And they're good indicators because of this long list here. And I put a really great set of terms there at the top. This is your 50-cent terminology lesson for the day. I hate the term cold-blooded. It doesn't fit. And so I like to use the appropriate term that amphibians are all poikilothermic ectotherms. All that means is they don't produce their own body heat, and their temperature fluctuates with the temperature of the environment. And so you can see that if there's changes in environmental temperature, it has a direct impact on the metabolism of these organisms. Amphibians typically have a biphasic life cycle where they have larvae that live in the water, like the tadpoles of the tailed frog there, shown in a fast-flowing cold water stream around here, and then they metamorphose into a terrestrial adult. So they get it in two different environments. They have a moist, permeable skin that's used primarily for respiration. So that bottom right photo there is of our Siskiyou mountain salamander, a regional endemic. And that and the Ensatina above it are salamanders that are lungless. They don't have lungs, and so they breathe entirely through their skin. You can sort of imagine what happens in a climate that is drying and warming to organisms like that. Amphibians also play really important and central roles in both aquatic and terrestrial food webs. And so alterations to their populations or eliminations of populations and those kinds of things have really big effects on the food webs and the communities that they're main players in. And many of these species have limited abilities to disperse. Some are widespread, some are very locally distributed, but mostly they have very limited abilities to disperse. That is, to get out of the way when environmental conditions go to hell in a handbasket. And I want to focus on a couple of species that I've been working on over the years here. And hopefully what I can do is sort of build into it a more general conversation about the impacts of changes to the habitats that sustain these two species that I'm going to talk about, and the impact that that likely has on many other diverse populations of other kinds of animals. And so I'm going to take us to first to Buckhorn, near Buckhorn Springs there at the confluence of Tyler Creek and Emigrant Creek. And then we're going to jump up the hill near the Green Springs Inn to a place called the Parsnip Lakes. And the two species that I'm going to talk about and focus on are the Oregon spotted frog, which is Rana pretiosa. In Latin, Rana just means frog, and pretiosa means the pretty one. And you can see why they refer to that as the pretty frog, I hope. And the foothill yellow-legged frog, Rana boylii, who comes by its name honestly, as you can see there in that photo of a large adult yellow-legged frog. The Oregon spotted frog has been recently listed, federally listed as threatened, because it's lost up to 94–95% of its historic range. And so it exists only in small isolated populations. And the population we have here is the southernmost and westernmost population of this species. And the foothill yellow-legged frog, once considered the most abundant and widely distributed frog species in our region, has now been proposed for listing and is currently under review for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so it's also a population that's in steep, or a species that's in steep decline, with very isolated populations. And the reason I want to focus on these two is because they're two populations that I and students in my herpetology classes doing other research have discovered and rediscovered populations that were once thought to have been regionally extinct. And we can learn a lot about the extinction process in response to changes in environmental conditions by looking at these sort of peripheral populations of amphibians. And so the yellow-legged frog, and this is going to be fairly brief, we discovered a population in Emigrant Creek above Emigrant Reservoir, which is now just inside the boundaries of the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. A student and I were up there working, and he heard something jump into the creek, and I said, there's only one thing it could be, and I reached under this carex mound and pulled out a large female yellow-legged frog, thought to have been extirpated from the Bear Creek watershed years ago. And since that time, we discovered that they were actually breeding there, both in Tyler Creek and Emigrant Creeks. And I would go back at the end of the summer, either in August or September, at the confluence of those streams at one particular pool and count these little froglets that you can see over here. Froglet is a wonderful term. These are juvenile metamorphic frogs that just were tadpoles a few months earlier. And the presence of them indicates that there was successful reproduction in that particular year. And I just included the graph to show what those counts have shown. This is from one pool right at the confluence. And what you notice is in some years there were lots of froglets, and other years not so many. And the past 2 years we haven't seen any, largely because the stream has dried up during the breeding season. These really high numbers here are during actually fairly dry years where the stream recedes and the population gets concentrated into these pools. But they still persisted. And I'm worried that this is what the stream looked like about 3 weeks ago. I went up to do my survey a little bit early, knowing that the stream had dried up, and this is the stream bed of Emigrant Creek. And basically the riparian zone here is deadly quiet. Not only have the frogs disappeared from here, but there are no more aquatic insects that are being produced as food for things like birds that live in the riparian zone, or lizards or snakes that feed in the terrestrial realm. It's a pretty quiet place these days. This is the last remaining pool where we typically see yellow-legged froglets, and for the last 2 years, again, because they have dried up during the breeding season, we haven't had any successful reproduction. I'm afraid that if conditions continue that way, this population is likely to go extinct in the very near future, if it hasn't already. Let's jump up the hill now, drive up Highway 66 just to near Tubbs Springs and take the turnoff to the Parsnip Lakes. And this topographic map shows the general location and the orientation. And I want to point out one really important geological feature of this map. And that is there's two groups of Parsnip Lakes. There's this lower group down here, and here's this upper group right here. And they're separated by a ridge line that is an old fault block that has rotated and created a basin on the backside here that is about 200 to 250 feet higher than this area down here on the downstream side of this rotated fault block. And basically what this rotated fault block does, it creates a trench on the backside that fills up with snowmelt and creates what most people refer to as the Parsnip Lakes. And this Parsnip Lakes is part of the Keene Creek drainage, which once historically had Oregon spotted frogs widespread throughout this drainage and over into Jenny Creek. Currently, they're only located in this cluster of lakes, and they reproduce primarily in only one of the ponds. And this is what it looks like from a Google Earth image. Here are the upper lakes. Here are the lower lakes. Here's that fault block right here. You can see Keene Creek flowing along here, Highway 66. And basically what happens is this fault block is broken basalt, and the water from these lakes drains out through a series of springs that coalesce to make a spring brook that flows into and out of these ponds, kind of like beads on a string, and ultimately empties into Keene Creek right here. And all of these ponds were built and historically maintained by beavers damming up the outflow, creating these big shallow wetland ponds, which are amazing breeding habitat for frogs and salamanders and a variety of different amphibians and the things that feed on them. And I want to point out that I'm talking about frogs here, but I really want people to recognize that this whole wetland complex is really a regionally significant aquatic habitat. There's nothing much like it on this scale anywhere else in the Southern Cascades or in our region. And it's part of the reason why we still have remnant populations of Oregon spotted frogs located here. So it's not just frog habitat, it's a very important regional wetland habitat for a wide diversity. It's a diversity hotspot for most animals. And this is what those upper lakes look like at different seasons. Here's the spring, and they're nice and full. Here's the summer with a profusion of higher aquatic plants growing here, a large muskrat population, a huge diversity of dragonflies and damselflies. Migratory songbirds breed in the riparian zone around these ponds. Lots of waterfowl use them. Western pond turtles have been seen in these upper ponds during the summer. And then usually by the autumn, the water starts to recede as some of it drains out, but it also evaporates. But historically, these ponds held water much of the year. And if they dried out late in the fall, which was a relatively rare occurrence. And this is just, again, a couple of Google Earth images showing those upper ponds here during mid-June in 2016, which was a relatively wet year with a reasonably good snowpack. And these ponds are fed entirely by snowpack. There's no surface water flowing into them. And this is what they look like typically in the late summer when they filled in with vegetation. You can still see there's some open water. And then here are the lower ponds, again, down here that receive water from these reservoirs to feed into the habitats where the Oregon spotted frog breeds. And this is a collage of slides showing what some of those lower habitats look like. They're shallower, marshier, more of what you think of in terms of wetlands. Here's the spring that comes out of the side of the fault block that feeds those ponds. We have a really big imagination. We call this the beaver pond because it has a big beaver dam that was built that creates it. The middle pond because guess what? It's in the middle. And the cattail marsh because it's a marsh that's full of cattails. I can't imagine how creative I've been in naming these things. And the species of concern here is the Oregon spotted frog. We've been monitoring this population. We discovered them in 2003. Again, having thought to have been extinct in this part of their range since the early 1970s. My herpetology class and I found the population breeding there in 2003. And we can monitor their populations and what's going on with them because they're communal breeders and they tend to oviposit, that is, deposit their egg masses like this in clusters in the same area, and they reproduce in the same places year after year after year. And so it's given us a good way to keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on with this population. And here's what's going on with this population. You can see these are the number of egg masses counted in that beaver pond, starting in 2005 to just this last spring. And it doesn't take much imagination to see that something's going on there, and this population is in relatively steep decline. And in years where there's very little snowpack, we've had no population, no reproduction at all in this population. And I think this is a site that is really important for us to look at in terms of how the climate is changing in our region and changing rapidly. We know that the predictions from most of the climate models suggest that in our region, particularly in the Cascade Mountains, we're going to see a decline in snowpack over time. And probably not a decline in overall precipitation, but an increase in rainfall and increase in the unpredictability of precipitation events that happen during the winter. And that's exactly what we've seen here at the Parsnip Lakes. This is the record of seasonal snowfall from November through April. And I put it in decadal averages here just to make the graph look a little bit easier. And I hung this point out here. This was this last spring. And if we look at the regression over that period of roughly 60 years, you can see that there's a steep decline. This last decade, the decline from the overall long-term average was about 20%, and this last year it was about a 30% decline, even though total precipitation, the graph is horizontal and there's been no change. So it does suggest that we're seeing that pattern happening here, and we're seeing it happen relatively quickly. And one of the most disturbing things that I've seen over the years recently in response to that curve is those beautiful upper lakes, those sag ponds that form the reservoir that feeds into the lower ponds, have dried 5 of the last 7 summers. A rare event is becoming much less rare. And in fact, last year, they were completely dry by early July. And this year, it was late May, early June that we saw the ponds completely dry. Now, that's still during the breeding season for most of the amphibians that occur there. It's also during the nesting season for many of the neotropical migratory birds that nest in the willows and alders around the margins of these ponds. Not much muskrat habitat here. So a lot of things suffer when these ponds go away due to a lack of snowpack. And the other thing that's really important in terms of the snowpack and what it does for breeding habitat for not just the frogs, but for just about everything that uses these ponds, is when we get a good snowpack year, we tend to get the hydrophytic vegetation, the cattails, the bulrush and things get matted down. You get these expansion of open water habitats, and you get longer breeding seasons that give organisms a chance to get through their entire reproductive cycle. During a really dry year when we have very little snow, as in 2014, there was virtually no snow on the ground throughout the winter of 2014. This is the primary breeding site for the Oregon spotted frog in this pond. In fact, over the years, this is where 90% of all egg masses have been observed. You can sort of guess what happened in 2014. This is what the pond looked like the first year we discovered the population in 2003. So a big impact happening very rapidly due to a change in our climate and our precipitation patterns we've observed just in the 20-some years that I've been studying this population. And another thing that has become really obvious, 2005 was the last year the beaver colony in the beaver pond here was active. This is their old lodge. This is a slide taken in 2008, 3 years after the beavers were last seen active in the pond. I discovered one of the large male beavers had been shot by hunters and abandoned there after they had taken away its tail and its head and its feet for souvenirs. And that seemed to do in that colony. And since that time, you can sort of see what's happened to the vegetation. Succession has increased. The beaver dam, which is right over here, has started to fail and the pond drains. And so we're losing a lot of the habitat for all the organisms that use this pond, not just the Oregon spotted frog. And so the question is, can we do something about restoring these habitats in order to both maintain water in this watershed, but to maintain habitat for all of the different species that are dependent on these kinds of habitats in our region. And I just want to make the case that as an aquatic ecologist and somebody who studies amphibians, and this could be the case made by people who study birds or people who study mammals or people who study insects like the dragonflies that use these ponds. One of the best ways for us to reestablish the resiliency in our watersheds in our region is to actually reestablish the beaver populations, and in the absence of that, use process-based restoration techniques that mimic beaver activity. And I want to make a plug for the Beaver Coalition, which is a group of beaver scientists, conservationists, and others who have developed a program and are working with restoring beavers on the landscape throughout our region to do that, to build in some resiliency for our watersheds in the face of climate disruption. And using this guide, this low-tech process-based restoration approach, Charlie Shells and I, Charlie is the ecologist with the monument. We did what was an unsuccessful beaver reintroduction. I can answer questions about that a bit later. We tried to reintroduce beavers into the beaver pond in 2019. For various reasons, that reintroduction failed. And so in 2020, we got a permit to do some habitat alteration, and Charlie and I used the low-tech approach to reinforce that beaver dam at the pond. And this is sort of what it looks like there with Charlie. And we did that a year ago winter. And this is based on a report I gave to the BLM just recently, showing what impact we had by trying to become beavers ourselves and trying to do some habitat restoration. And a couple of key points to make here. The inflow, that spring brook flowing into the beaver pond in September 2019 was 4.8 liters per second, and in September 2020 was 1.69. So it was about a third of the flow because of a very dry winter. We installed those BDAs in February of 2020, and we immediately saw an increase in the surface elevation of between 5 to 13 centimeters. This year, that elevation gain is even higher, and it's been maintained. And the lateral expansion of the pond has extended out up to 10 meters and more this year. So we've increased the size, we've increased the amount of water being stored in those basins, the amount of water in the sponge that then can be wrung out to feed into the riparian habitats along King Creek, Jenny Creek, and ultimately into the Klamath River. And just quickly to show you some slides of what that looked like between October, the fall of 2019, the driest time of the year, and 2020 after we put in the BDAs. That's the beaver pond. This is a portion of the beaver pond. This is another one of the oviposition sites for the Oregon spotted frog. And you can see how much the water level has increased. This is an area where the inflow comes in, and again, you can see a dramatic impact of having beavers on the landscape in the form of Charlie Shells and Michael Parker. And I'll end with a pretty picture.
That was great. Thank you so much. That's so encouraging to see some success happening up in the monument.
Alan said he wanted to see some actions that could be taken, and that's the one that I think we've shown works.
Yeah, that's so exciting. That's really great. I'm excited to see how that continues. We do have a couple questions in chat. We've got a couple minutes to address those. Kathy had a question for John. Do you see evidence that the changing climate is resulting in forest composition shifting following fires?
Yes, definitely. One of the main effects that I've been noticing is this. Basically, in a lot of places, you're getting what amounts to a conversion of the forest from a mixed conifer hardwood forest. In a lot of these places, the conifers are having a hard time coming back in after fire, especially when you consider the salvage logging. What's happening is the landscape is just being heated up to higher temperatures than allow for the conifers to reproduce. And so we're getting this shift of where we're getting more dominated by the madrone and the oak and some of the deciduous trees that can survive in the warmer climate. And it's climate change related, but it's also related to fire and related to landscape management. You can't come in and they come in and they cut the trees after it's burned, and it's just adding insult to injury to the landscape. And then you're not going to get the same forest coming back in afterwards. And we're seeing that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, John. Right, this question is for Michael. Have there been any studies on the effects of wildfire smoke on lungless amphibians?
Not that I am aware of, and I'm guessing there's probably not much of an impact. Most of those lungless salamanders in our forested regions spend their summers deep in the ground. So they go down in animal burrows or in talus slopes or places where they get away from the dry surface with the high humidity, and they get down as deep as they can into the ground where the humidity is higher and more moderate. And so they probably don't experience the smoke much. I can tell you though, the amphibians with lungs, we just did our night surveys for Oregon spotted frogs a couple of weeks ago, and it was a very smoky night. And we saw 2 frogs, which is the lowest count we've ever had during the nighttime. Whether that has anything to do with the smoke or whether it has to do with the heat dome that we recently went through, it's unclear, but there could be an effect, and everybody was talking about that.
And then the question that everybody probably wants to know, are there going to be any additional attempts to introduce beavers in the monument?
Yes. In fact, the reason I put a plug in for the Beaver Coalition, I spent some time this summer with folks from that organization walking around the monument, looking at sites. They've done an amazing model looking at potential habitat where beaver probably once were very abundant and where they could once again be reintroduced to do the same kinds of things. And so fingers crossed, we'll have a lot more beavers on the landscape, holding back that water and making our watersheds more resilient for the future.
Great, that's really exciting. Thank you both so much. That was all the questions we had in the chat. If you did not get a question and answer that you had in your mind, you're going to be sent a survey probably already in your inbox. And that's another opportunity to ask any questions that you didn't get to ask during the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand things off to Kathy.
Thank you, Allie. So the connect to the beaver information, if you go to socan.eco/action, and then under the collective action column is heading climate and species of concern. And on that page are links that you might find interesting from tonight's presentation. I'm going to very quickly go through upcoming events that SOCAN and other people in the area have. Everything I'm saying you can find on socan.eco/events, our calendar. So SOCAN has different programs and then projects under each program. We have 5 different program areas. So to share with you tonight, under the community engagement program, Coastal SOCAN usually meets, would be September 15th. They're not going to meet in September this month, but they're recommending people view A Conversation with Climate Scientist Catherine Hayhoe. And that's something that any of us can do. If you go to the SOCAN calendar, you'll see the link to that. You have to register. It's on Friday, September 10th, and that should be a very good presentation. The next thing under the community engagement program is SOCAN's next monthly meeting, which will be September 28th. The focus is going to be on businesses taking action. we have a project that has asked different businesses to share what they are doing. And so there's going to be a presentation by 3 of those businesses. And the information is again on the SOCAN calendar. These are all the businesses that have completed the form so far. And the 3 that we're going to feature are Banyan Botanicals, Medford Food Co-op, and Motel Del Rogue. So that will be the focus of next month's program. The SOCAN Master Climate Protector is part of the education program, and that will start in February of next year. For people who've graduated from that program, we have a refresher every year, and this year's will be on September 13th, and registration is required for that. So if you're part of the graduates from the Master Climate Protector, we hope you'll join us that evening. Under the government program, the Ashland Climate Action Project has a Zoom conversation, and that will be Thursday, September 9th. The topic is collaborative conservation, and the speaker will be Susan Jane Brown, who's with the Western Environmental Law Center. You need to register to be part of that activity, and we strongly recommend that program. The federal and state project will meet on Monday, September 13th. There's a special visit with Tracy Darrow, and there will be an action item in the broadcast that will come out the first part of September, asking you to contact the governor to urge DEQ to strengthen its climate protection program. This is very important that we get a variety of voices making comments, and there'll be information on that in that broadcast for details and how you can get more information. Also under the government program is the County City Project. That'll meet on September 23rd. And what that group is doing is it's formed 2 action teams. There's the Community Action Team and the Electrification Action Team. Those will be meeting earlier in September with a whole group coming together once a month, and September's meeting will be the 23rd. Under natural resources, the Forest and Fire Project is meeting on Wednesday, September 15th, and that link is on the calendar. Under other activities, the SOCAN Leadership Circle will meet on September 8th. All the project leaders come together and talk about what is happening, how we can help each other. But if you are new to SOCAN and interested in the different things we're doing, that's an excellent time to come and just listen in to what's going on, and you're always invited to join us. Other projects are listed here. These just don't have current meetings, but there are other things. If those interest you, please contact the people who are leading those. Other groups, we like to recognize their work. The Citizens Climate Lobby, the Southern Oregon group has a monthly meeting. That'll be on September 11th. They have a national meeting at 10, and then at 10:45, they have the local meeting. And for that, if you go to Facebook and then look for Southern Oregon CCL, you'll get the details of that meeting. ROCPAC is our Rural Oregon Climate Political Action Committee. We encourage you to look at what they're doing on their website and support them in any way that you can. And I would like to end with a big thanks to John and Michael. Really appreciate all your expertise and the time that you spent being with us and sharing tonight. That was very informative, and we really, really appreciate what you presented. Also to Ellie for facilitating questions. That's always something that's hard to pull together, and really appreciate that. And to Hogan for putting together introductions and helping with putting the program together. Thanks also to all of you for being here. This wouldn't happen without you and your interest, and hope you learned something. and very glad that you joined us. So please consider actions that you can take to protect species of concern. Our biologists can't do this on their own. They need all of us. So please consider helping. And some of these species don't have much time. So we need not to sit back and think about it, but to get involved in what we can do to help protect these habitats. I sent a survey to you. It's very short. If you can complete that and just submit it, that's very helpful to us as we plan these. SOCAN website and questions, if you have them, you can always send them to info@socan.eco. And if you're able and can make a donation, that's what keeps us going with all our projects and activities. And again, I'd like to thank you for all being here, and thanks to Michael and to John for the wonderful presentation. And we'll stay around for a couple minutes if anybody wants to stay with comments, but at this point, we'll go ahead and end the recording. Thank you very much.